one that we do. If you have a Bible and find it helpful, please turn in it to the 12th chapter of Luke. This is where we're going to be spending our time. And for all of us in this room, and really it goes beyond this room, it goes to every human being that's walking on the planet right now. Whether they're a baby in the hospital lying in one of those plastic containers, or they're a person in a nursing home who's waiting for hospice. We're all on a journey. And that journey is one that for every human being that's now presently alive is going to end up just one way unless Jesus comes back. We're going to journey to the point that that journey ceases, and then we're going to leave this world. All you've got to do is go to one funeral and you can be reminded that we're on that journey. Very important to keep that in mind as we look at what Jesus teaches us here today. I'll begin reading in verse 34, which is the last verse from last week. Jesus says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be." He says, "Be dressed, ready for service, and keep your lamps burning, like those who are waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet, so that when the master comes and knocks, the servants can immediately get up and open the door for the master. It'll be good for those servants if the master finds them watching for him when the master comes. I tell you the truth, the master will dress himself to serve the servants, will have them recline at the table, and then he will come in and wait on them. It'll be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if the master comes in the second or the third watch of the night. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known what hour the thief was coming, he would have not let the house be broken into. You also must be ready," he says to us, "because the Son of Man will come in an hour when we do not expect him." Peter said, "Lord, are you telling this parable to us or to everybody?" The Lord answered, "Who is the faithful and wise manager whom the master puts in charge of all of his servants to give them their food allowance in due season? It'll be good for this servant whom the master finds doing the good work when the master returns. I tell you the truth, the master will put that servant in charge of all of his possessions. But suppose the servant says, 'My master's taking a long time in coming back,' and that servant begins to beat the other servants, to eat and to drink and to get drunk. The master of that servant will come on a day when the servant doesn't expect the master, and at an hour that the servant is not aware of. He'll cut the servant into pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers." Very hard text here. And Jesus is speaking to us of two different things. He's speaking of his second coming, when the master comes back, but he's also speaking to us of our own death, the fact that we're going to leave this world. For me, the second coming part of it, I've heard sermons on it all my life, when I wasn't a believer and then after I'm a believer. Doesn't really affect me that way very much. I don't see my life in that sense of living it just to wait for Jesus' return. But the death part of it I do see. And that's because I have been to funerals and I've done some of them. And there's a sense in which that death thing seems a lot more immediate to me than Jesus' second coming. I mean, we've been here 2,000 years nearly, and Jesus has not returned. It's very hard for me to relate to his coming back and to be worried about being ready for that. It's very real, but it's harder for me to think that way. Jesus speaks of us of being servants and to be working until he returns. Well, what does that mean? He uses a lot of metaphors here. He talks about people girding up their loins, which for them would have made a ton of sense. It doesn't make any sense for us. I mean, we use it now as a kind of a metaphor to get ready to work. But for them, in Palestine in that his time in history, they all wore the flowing robes like you see some Arabs wearing today. And if you're going to work, you've got to get that thing out of your way because it touched right down to the ground. So what do? You gather it up, you loop it around inside the sash that you wear around your waist. You gird your loins, making yourself ready for work so that your legs are free to move. So we had to prepare for work. And Jesus uses this metaphor to say, you and I need to live our lives in preparation, not only for his return, but for our leaving this world properly. It's kind of like this comic strip I saw one time where this guy comes up to somebody and he sticks his finger in his back. Now the guy's got his back turned, the other guy. And the first person with his finger in the guy's back says, it's a stick up. The guy raises his hand, he says, give me all your money. But somehow the guy that was stuck up thought, something doesn't seem right about this, so he turned around and saw that the guy just had the finger stuck in there into his chest, and he said, what do you mean it's a stick up? You don't even have a weapon. The guy says, well, as soon as you give me your money, that's the first thing I'm going to go out and buy when I leave here. There's a sense in which this guy's not ready to be a stick-up artist. He's still got something that has to be done in order to get ready. And for you and me, when we think about Jesus saying, okay, live your life to be ready to leave this world, whether it's me returning or you dying, live in a way that makes you ready for that. There's no finish line there for us. It's an open-ended being ready. I think about it this way. If there were a finish line, if there were some way that you and I could live our life in such a way that we were living it ready enough, then we would just poof into heaven. We would just disappear. We wouldn't stay here there'd be no reason for us to stay here. But clearly there is a reason. There's something for us to do. And that busyness at living a life that is ready for Jesus, we kind of talked about it in Sunday school a little bit. There's a peace that comes along with that. If you and I know that we're living our lives ready for His return or ready for us to leave this world, that's a peaceful way to live. I think about it in terms of my own life. Everybody's called to do something in this world for Jesus. Everybody. And to be able to live in that calling day in and day out, thinking to myself, if Jesus comes back and catches me doing this, I feel pretty good about it. Whatever it is, whether it's your job or it's the way you're treating your family at home or the way you're treating somebody at a store when you're a customer or the way you treat a waitress or waiter or anything that we're doing. Since everything we do has become sacred because of Jesus living inside of us, then we can do everything we're doing, no matter how mundane or ordinary it seems, and it can be done in a way as to say, I'm ready for you to take me home right now, if you want. And I'm also ready to leave this world if that's what happens. I'll tell you, that means something. It means something to me. What would we think? Do you all ever think about it? Somebody said it this morning. I think it was you, Al, that said you don't ever know when God is going to call you out. We don't know. None of us sitting here right now, I could not even finish this next sentence and God could call me out. And that would be it. So do we live with that kind of thinking in our minds all the time? I'd have to say no for myself. I can't speak for any of you in here. Some of you in here may just absolutely live like that 24/7. I do not. And I wonder what that means, what it would even look like. I think to set that standard out there like that, in the way that we're seeing this here, that's a different standard than anybody lives in this world. Because there are parts of this life that to us seem separated from who we are as followers of Jesus. We just don't see it that way. But I assure you it is that way. This is why we see people in, say, for instance, marital relationships where there's a lot of strife. Why is that? Well, we can point to all kinds of practical reasons, but I'm going to say if you got two people and both of them know Jesus, and they're not living that married life in the sense of, I'm called to be this person's husband, or I'm called by God to be this person's wife, and I'm going to live my life as a living sacrifice toward that person, that explains a lot to me. I think about it in terms of every aspect of what we do. If we're not living that way, it affects those realms, and we start to see all kinds of difficulties. And we talk about it in terms of things like drug abuse or alcohol abuse or just being a mean person or making really bad choices. God How many of us think of it this way? How many of us think about whatever it is we know how to do? I mean, I know a lot of you guys are retired, but just think about what you're really good at. How many of us live our lives thinking that Jesus knows more about that than we do, whatever it is? That Jesus is the smartest person who's ever lived. Not just in terms of being able to tell us about the life hereafter and that sort of thing, but telling us how it is we should take care of a lawn, or how it is we should do plumbing, or how it is we should do whatever we do. That's a very different way. Or how to be a husband, or how to be a wife, or how to be a father, or a mother, or a friend. I think he's the smartest person who ever lived. And I think he wants to be part of all those realms of who we are. This steward that Jesus speaks of here, this is a time in history when slavery was just practiced, and that's the way it was. Not the kind of slavery that we practiced in this country or in Western Europe, where a person was kidnapped practically and then sold into slavery and used as a tool. Were these people used as tools? Kinda. But they were there for a very different reason. There's no social security. There's no welfare. There are no food stamps. There's none of that. So if a person fell on hard times and they had a family, their only choice was to sell themselves into slavery and say, I'll work for you until I work this debt off. I mean, it was that or starve. So in this steward's life, this steward is a slave. In most Jewish households, if they had a steward, that steward was a slave. And the steward would be in control of all of the household. It'd be like the chief person in charge of running your farm or whatever you did. The steward would see to all. We have people like that today. I knew a person over in Waycross who went to work for a family, and all that she did was take care of paying the bills, making sure the electric bill was paid, the water bill was paid, the insurances were paid, handled all the books, while the other person, that family, just went out and made gobs of money. They wanted her to oversee all that stuff they just didn't want to have to deal with. Well, that's what the steward would do. And this steward would be one who would be so responsible that when Jesus uses this example of the steward, everybody in that crowd would have known exactly what he meant. It was a servant who was responsible for all of the other servants, control of the household. So if we understood stewardship of our own lives in this way, we would see it in that sense of Jesus makes us responsible for things in ways that a believer, unbeliever doesn't have to be responsible. And that means every aspect of who we are. We've become the stewards over the life he's given us to live. Just like this steward here is overseer over everything in that household. Everything in this household, God has given me to be a steward over. Everything. That's pretty significant. And I'm on that journey myself. I'm moving, my life is moving toward that end where either it's going to be Jesus returns and I'm busy about the work that he's given me to do, or I leave this world busy about the work he's given me to do. The one thing I can't do is what this one farmer did, who two farmers meet across a fence post, and one farmer's out in the field, the other one's just standing there, and the farmer comes up and says, how's it going? He said, oh, it's going okay. And the farmer who's standing outside the field, the farmer inside the field says, well, what are you doing this year? And the first farmer that's standing outside the field says, not really a whole lot. He said, what are you talking about? Didn't you plant any corn? The farmer says, nah, I've heard there's a real problem with corn worms this year, and there's a likelihood of a drought, so I didn't plant any corn. Well, how about some cotton? Are you going to plant some cotton? He says, no, I've heard there's a serious concern with the boll weevil this year, so I'm not going to plant any cotton. He said, well, how about some potatoes? Are you going to plant potatoes? He said, I've heard about a fungus that's going to kill all the potatoes, so I'm not going to plant them. The farmer says, well, what are you doing? The farmer standing outside the fence says, well, I'm just going to play it safe. I'm not going to plant anything at all. Well, that's just not at all what Jesus is asking us to do, to play it safe like that. He's asking us to entertain doing for him in everything that we do. I can't imagine not being a believer, because as a believer, I can live my life in this sense of abandonment to this world. I can just throw myself into stuff, and if I'm spending time that looks to me like a waste, it's not. It's not a waste, because if I'm spending it, living it in a way that says I'm looking ahead to that point where I'm going to leave, one way or the other, then I'm spending it well, and I've got eternity waiting on me. I don't have to worry. If I want to stand and talk with Al for 30 or 40 minutes, so what? I've got eternity waiting. That's not going to be wasted time for me. If I see somebody I know and I want to spend some time talking with them, and I spend what looks to be too much, who cares? I can invest myself in those places with abandonment, because I've got an eternity waiting. That's a very different picture of what it looks like to live in this world without Jesus. Without that eternity, everything becomes important. How we spend time becomes very important to us. Jesus is really trying to set us free from that. I look at this unfaithful servant here who is going to beat the other servants and get drunk and have a party. I look at that servant, and this is the only equation I can make that makes sense to me. In the church today, in Christianity today, we have people who are in churches, and all they do is beat everybody else in the church by being critical of the church. That's all they do. Find a bunch of things to complain about instead of living in the church as faithful stewards of their own life. They just look at everybody else's life and complain about what's going on. I just wonder what Jesus thinks about that. The difficulty for you and me is, how do we live in this sense of anticipation, knowing that we're on that journey and it's going to end? It's either going to end with us in a box, or Jesus is going to come back. There is only one way, and that's to say to ourselves, you know what? I'm going to make sure that every aspect of who I am and what I do becomes a living sacrifice to Him, no matter how insignificant it seems to me, because none of it's insignificant to Him. None of it. Do you and I want the peace that we can have living in this world, knowing that we're living our lives in that sense of that sacred journey that we're all on, where everything we do is surrendered to Him in that way? I want that peace. I want to have that peace all the time. So, I know there are just a few of us in this room, but I would just say, don't ever leave a situation like this if for you that issue of how you're living your life is not settled. Are we living it in that sense of anticipation? Are we living it in that sense of, I belong to Him and everything about my life is going to be lived as though it belongs to Him? Jesus said it last week. He said, don't be afraid, little flock. Your Father's been pleased to give you the whole kingdom. The whole kingdom. Don't we want that? I do. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've